Hello everybody, and welcome back to what is now the fifth in our series of talks for the Friends of Reading Abbey. And in this session, what I want to do is explore really the end, the demise of the Abbey. And I think most of us understand and have some feeling for what happened locally in terms of the poor old abbot being executed and the Abbey being closed. But what I wanted to explore is the wider context, what was going on in England, particularly at that time. And so I'm absolutely delighted to invite along an old friend, the Right Reverend Jonathan Baker, who's the Bishop of Fulham. And Jonathan studied English at Oxford, and he was considering becoming a lawyer. And then in his own words, he decided on a higher form of advocacy, is the way he described it. His connection with Reading goes back to when he was the vicar of Holy Trinity Church on the Oxford Road and St Mark's on Cranby Road, and he was there for about 7 years. And he subsequently became the principal of Pusey House in Oxford, Bishop of Ebbsfleet, and now he's the Bishop of Fulham. So welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you, David. Delighted to be here.
So middle of the early 1500s, mid-1520s, England was under the rule of Henry VIII. It was still a Catholic country, and Henry was sort of described as Fido Defensor, the defender of the faith, but it was a Catholic faith. And yet only 30 years later, in about the 1550s, England was ruled by Henry's daughter, Elizabeth, and it was now a Protestant country. The monasteries had been dissolved, and the bishops had paid their allegiance to the Queen. And what I want to understand was, how did that come about? What an extraordinary short period. What had driven those changes? What was the connection between the Reformation and the dissolution of the abbeys? And of course, how was Reading Abbey and its abbot caught up in this upheaval? And then one particular question that a number of us ask is, how would English history have been different if Henry and Queen Catherine had actually produced a male heir? So plenty of ground for us to cover in about 40 minutes. So let's start off and talk about sort of England and the English Church in the 1520s. Jonathan.
So, David, as you said, in common with every other country in Western Europe at the turn of the 16th century, England is a Catholic country. In fact, it's known, for example, for devotion to Mary, devotion to Mary, the mother of Jesus. England is known as Our Lady's Dowry, so a country of a rich Catholic devotional and spiritual life. An earlier view of the Reformation might have been that it was preceded by a time of great religious decline and decay. But the work, particularly of the Cambridge historian Eamon Duffy, has shown that actually there was a lively and vivid religious life, Catholic life, in England on the eve of the Reformation. But of course there were other currents. If you go a little bit further back in English history, you get the tradition of the Lollards, a group of people back in the 14th century who had begun to explore some of the ideas which would underpin the Reformation around justification by faith and so on and so forth. And crucially, you have the figure of Henry VIII himself, who, as we've heard, defender of the faith, writes a great treatise in 1520, 1521 in defence of the seven sacraments of the Catholic Church. So as someone who thinks about his faith and thinks quite deeply about his relationship with God. He's very mindful that his own father, Henry VII, has taken the throne through conquest, doesn't have the strongest dynastic claim, so a sense of divine providence that's put the Tudor dynasty where it is. And I think that becomes very important when, of course, we come on to the great matter of Henry's marriage and the failure to produce a male heir.
Very interesting. And just to take it down to ground level, I think we know there are about 800 odd monasteries around the country. Can you give us a sense of how the monasteries interrelated to the churches, the church in the community, the abbot, the monks, and then local sort of vicars? Were vicars then in existence?
So the place of houses of the religious life, monasteries, convents, friaries, is absolutely at the heart of English life at the turn of the 16th century. Some 800 religious houses in England. It's been said that everyone in England would have lived within half an hour's walk of a monastery or a convent or a friary. And just to tease apart those different terms, monasteries, principally of the Benedictine tradition, monks living, as it were, an enclosed life, friaries where the friars are going out into the towns, into the villages and communities. Centres primarily, of course, of prayer, the image that we're sort of familiar with of the bells of the monastery church ringing and the people working in the fields knowing the monks were going to prayer. But also, of course, hugely significant in terms of the sort of social structures of England, centres of employment, centres of hospitality, centres, of course, of alms giving to the poor. So one of the things that we reflect on is, just as we look at how this story unfolds, is the rapidity in the space of 5 or 6 years. A phenomenon that was really at the heart of English life is, to all intents and purposes, obliterated. Quite an extraordinary revolution, really.
So you've described to us this sort of relationship, very close relationship between the sort of monastic and church life and the rest of society. But also, as I understand it, the church had a very important role in terms of law. They actually controlled some laws, and perhaps there's one particular point you might expand on.
So what we need to remember about medieval England on the eve of the Reformation is that marriage, everything really to do with the institution of marriage, is controlled by the church. Marriage is a sacrament, and the Catholic Church has a thorough revision and, as it were, reorganisation of its law, its canon law, in the 12th century. And so by the time we get to the early 16th century, whether it's to do with who may marry, issues of who you're related to, what's called consanguinity, whether you can marry your second cousin or your third cousin, issues around marriage contract, issues around the validity of marriage, and of course issues around the annulment of marriages, crucial to get the church's approval, and of course that becomes hugely significant for Henry VIII.
That's my next point, and you're leading us quite nicely to this next thing, which described, I don't know if at the time or later, but the King's great matter. And we know that King Henry was married to Catherine Aragon. They produced her having one live daughter, being Mary. But unfortunately, they'd been, I think, married for about 16 years and hadn't produced a boy. And that clearly was a big issue. We understand, obviously, historically, that the lack of male heirs created great problems for the throne. And here we have a king who's massively frustrated he hasn't got a male heir. So then talk us through what starts to happen.
So, as I think I mentioned earlier, Henry VIII, the second Tudor king, his father, Henry VII, acquires the throne through victory in battle, and the Battle of Bosworth, of course. And so Henry VIII is very mindful, I think, of the fragility of his dynasty, as are all the thinkers of England, mindful of the civil war that we call the Wars of the Roses of the 15th century. And Catherine, Henry's bride, has previously been married to Henry's older brother, Arthur, who sadly dies. And so Henry, who, as I said, is, I think, someone who's very concerned to be right with God. Henry's reading of the scriptures, and particularly of two passages in the book of Leviticus, come to persuade him that he was wrong, he was in error to marry his deceased brother's wife, and that the Pope, who had actually granted a dispensation to allow him to do that, was wrong. And Henry comes to believe that no Pope on earth really has the power to overturn what he believes is the teaching of the Bible in the book of Leviticus. And Henry believes that he is in the right in his opinions because he has had no male heir. That's proof, if you like, that God is angry with him. And the fact that he has no male heir demonstrates that his marriage to Catherine should never have taken place. And so what Henry is determined to do is to assert that he is not married to Catherine. He was never married to Catherine. The marriage was invalid from the start. And that's what, through his ministers, particularly of course through Wolsey, he tries to get the Pope effectively to change his mind and say, actually, I shouldn't have given the dispensation. Your marriage to Catherine is null and void. And of course, that's what the Pope will not do.
So we know he sent out his Lord Chancellor Wolsey, I think, out to obviously the Vatican, 2 years of trying to negotiate, lobby on behalf of the King, unsuccessfully. And actually, this also, I think, the first point when the Abbey of Reading gets involved, because we know that Hugh Farringdon wrote to the Pope urging him to accede to the King's request. We know also that he lent Henry books to try and build his case, so there's an involvement there. Okay, so we get to about 1529, and Rome essentially says refuses a divorce, annulment or divorce.
So it's quite important that we're talking about annulment. What Henry wants is the Pope to say that he and Catherine are not married and never were married. So there's a difference there between obviously how we understand divorce today, which is ending marriage. What Henry wants is for the Pope to say this is not a marriage. They were never married in the first place.
And one of the things I struggle to understand is, when we've seen this again with various negotiations with Europe and so on, you'd have thought the Pope would understand the driving force, why Henry so desperately needed to have a male heir. One would have thought he'd have found a point of compromise, some way of facilitating Henry to basically to remarry and produce an heir. It seems very intransigent and ultimately completely sort of negative.
So I think one thing we have to be aware of course, in this period is that the Pope is not simply a spiritual leader, but also very much, as it were, a sort of political player in the politics of continental Europe. And one of the things about Catherine of Aragon is that she's the niece of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. And it's very important to Pope Clement that he stays in the Emperor's good books, to put it very simply. And so there's a factor there that it's going to be hard to get this Pope to turn against Catherine because she is the Emperor's niece.
So at this point we're stuck. Henry obviously cannot rid himself, but basically detach himself from the Queen. He essentially sacks Wolsey, doesn't he? And says, look, you're not achieving the aim here, let's try something else. And he appoints Cranmer, who's the Archbishop of Canterbury. You might say that Cranmer very much took a very different line. So,
yes, we have Cranmer, but I think the other figure that we ought to mention at this point is Thomas Cromwell, who has been one of Wolsey's great servants, has really been sort of brought up and brought on by Cromwell. And Cromwell is perhaps the greatest architect of what unfolds over the next few years, and when we come on particularly to thinking about the dissolution of the monasteries. And the interesting thing about Cromwell is I talked about the Catholic character of England in the early 16th century. Cromwell is somebody who, although it's very difficult to be absolutely sure about the sort of interior views of historical figures, but we know that Cromwell lent towards religious reform. He's what we might call an evangelical. He seemed to be very sympathetic to the currents of thinking which were questioning some aspects of traditional Catholic structures and beliefs. So he was open. He was beginning to move on in his thinking towards some of the currents of religious reform.
So we get to about 1533. Cranmer ruled that Henry's marriage to Catherine was illegal due to the early betrothal to Arthur, and essentially he then ruled that marriage to Anne Boleyn, I think we're calling her, was valid. And then we have Cromwell actually strong-arming it through Parliament, forcing Parliament to actually accept the Act of Royal Supremacy. So do you want to take us along from there?
Yes, so if we go back to Henry, who, as I said, was so keen for the Pope, and therefore, as it were, the Pope on behalf of God, to give him what he wants, to say, your marriage to Catherine is invalid. And when that is demonstrably not going to happen, very crudely, the answer is that Henry says, well, I will do this for myself. And so you have Cromwell, as David said, steering through a number of Acts of Parliament the consequences of which are to declare Henry the supreme head of the church in England, to legislate to take away rights of appeal to Rome, and effectively to bring together, I think this is the point one really wants to make about this, to bring together in the crown and in the person of the king both temporal rule and spiritual jurisdiction. And this, I think, is something that is hugely important to Henry, and certainly some historians would suggest that his desire to achieve the royal supremacy over the church was actually independently running alongside his need to set Catherine aside and marry Anne. So it's the bringing together into his royal person and into the crown jurisdiction over the church. And of course, there's a long history of struggle between church and state, between the jurisdiction of the king and the jurisdiction of the church. We go back to another great period in English history and the martyrdom of Thomas Becket. That was a struggle between kingly rule and the separate powers and jurisdiction of the church and of bishops. So in that sense, it's not completely new, but of course it comes to a head under Henry VIII in a completely new way, with Henry declaring himself the head of the church.
So at this point, and it's very important again to get this sense of timing, so we're up to about 1534. Henry's now remarried, he has a new queen. Hugh Farringdon, locally, just to pick a local picture, Hugh Farringdon swore an oath accepting the divorce of the king, his marriage to Anne Boleyn. So again, he's on side, he supported what the king has done. So we get to the sort of the point where the transition has happened. We've now got a Church of England, in England, and Henry's obviously supreme and he's in charge. So then, do we then see a sudden transformation of the church, what's happening in England, or is there some sort of continuity during Henry's reign?
So Henry, as we've said, determined to achieve the royal supremacy, but broadly still pretty conservative and Catholic in his religious outlook. I say broadly, but with some quite significant exceptions. So in terms of the Reformation, which is taking hold in parts of Europe, Northern Europe in particular, following on the teachings of Martin Luther, the doctrine at the heart of Luther's appeal for reform is what we call justification by faith. Luther believes that it's by faith in Christ alone that we are saved. Henry never accepts that. He continues to believe very strongly that faith must be accompanied by good works, must be accompanied by the exercise of charity and so on and so forth. That's a very Catholic understanding of the way that the Christian should behave and the way that we achieve salvation. Henry continues to have a very Catholic understanding of the Mass. He continues to believe in penance as a sacrament. But on the other hand, from quite early on, and this is important for the dissolution of the monasteries, he's quite opposed to what he sees as superstitious use of relics. He becomes very opposed to pilgrimage, and he seems to take out of his understanding of the sacraments of the church a sacramental view of the priesthood. He hangs on to baptism, to the Mass, to penance, but he doesn't talk so much about the sacred power of priests and of the sacrament of ordination. Not surprising, really, when he's made himself head of the church as a layman. He's taken to himself powers held by the Pope, by a bishop. So Henry is an interesting combination of some continuity in matters of faith, together with some departures. And of course, Henry, as a young man, when he was just a boy, he'd been visited by the great Catholic humanist scholar Erasmus. He is open to new learning, to humanist scholarship. And of course we remember that even some very committed Catholics like Thomas More and Erasmus did believe that there were perhaps some things that were less than ideal about some aspects of the monastic life, particularly around this business of veneration of relics and so on. They did see superstition and so on creeping in here. So Henry, this very interesting combination of his personal commitment to the royal supremacy, his conservatism in lots of areas of faith, but also his turning against some traditional practices. And that's particularly important, I think, for the dissolution of the monasteries.
So now we're closing in on this relationship between Reformation and the impact on the abbeys. So initially it feels that Henry's made some changes, but there's not a significant impact on the abbey. One can imagine these abbots and monks looking on somewhat nervously about how it's going to affect them. But initially it looks like they're going to carry on as they have been for decades. And then 1535, Cromwell commissions his commissioners to go out and produce this sort of list, the Valor Ecclesiasticus, essentially a stock take of what they've got in terms of all the religious houses. That, I suspect, might have put them on notice that things were going to start to happen.
So I think the first phase of the dissolution of the monasteries, which is really about the smaller houses, it's difficult to be absolutely clear what's in the mind of Cromwell and therefore in the mind of the king at this stage. There might be a view that really from the beginning this was a determined programme to grab the assets, frankly, to get hold of the land, the buildings and the cash. There is another view that in the early stages at least there was a genuine desire for reform. The truth is that the pattern of religious life in England at this time was probably very mixed, that there were some monastic houses which were really failing to be what they should have been, where numbers had dwindled, where it was increasingly difficult to keep those all-important routines of prayer going and so on and so forth, where things had become rather lax. Now, the document, the inquiry that you referred to, David, was probably elements of truth, but also a lot of propaganda. So a lot of monks were convicted of sins, particularly sexual sins, and again, may well have been an element of truth, but probably quite a lot was hyped up to serve Cromwell's purposes. So that's where we were with the first wave of dissolution, and some of the great abbots, including the Abbot of Reading, actually seem to support this. They seem to be in favour of this first wave of inquiry, perhaps hoping that if they supported the first wave, they would then be left alone.